When you detach from an avoidant person, it doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you stop chasing. Detachment is about letting go of the need to fix, to prove, or to constantly explain yourself. It's the choice to step back and let them feel the space they've been creating. Most people get caught in a loop with avoidance, running after them the moment they pull away, thinking closeness is built by closing the gap, but all that does is fuel the cycle. When you detach, you send the message that you're not here to carry the entire relationship on your back. And that's when the avoidant starts to notice the weight of their own actions. It's not punishment, it's perspective, and it shifts the balance without you having to lift a finger. Detachment makes their distance visible. An avoidant spends so much energy pushing space between you that they don't notice what it feels like until you stop filling it. When you no longer rush to call, text, or fix the silence belongs to them. It's in that gap they begin to realize the absence isn't peace, it's emptiness. Avoidants often believe pulling away protects them, but when you detach, you let them sit in the reality of that choice. They start to feel the consequences, not through confrontation, but through contrast, and that's a powerful shift. You don't need to lecture, you don't need to demand, you simply let your absence highlight what your presence used to provide. The hardest part about detachment is resisting the urge to explain why you're doing it. Many people think they owe the avoidant a detailed breakdown of boundaries, but the truth is, clarity doesn't always come from words, it comes from behavior. Your silence, your composure, your refusal to chase communicates more than any long conversation could. And while the avoidant might initially act like they don't notice, trust me, they do. They notice the calls that don't come, the arguments that don't start, the effort that isn't being made for them anymore. That's when realization begins to creep in because the dynamic that once worked for them is no longer being fueled by you. Detachment is not the same as giving up. It's about stepping out of the game. The avoidant thrives on the push and pull, and when you don't play, the game ends. Suddenly, they can't point fingers at your reactions because you're not reacting. They can't dismiss you as being too much because you're not giving them anything to dismiss. This forces them to face their own choices without distraction. That's uncomfortable for them, but it's also necessary. Growth doesn't happen when you keep making things easier for someone. Growth happens when they feel the weight of their own behavior. Many people confuse detachment with coldness, but that's not what this is. You can detach with love, with grace, and with calm. You're not shutting the door, you're simply refusing to carry the responsibility of both people in the relationship. You stop micromanaging their emotions, stop anticipating their withdrawal, stop cushioning their avoidance. Instead, you focus on your own balance, your own peace, your own self-worth, and it's in that shift that the avoidant realizes what they've been taking for granted, because while they've been trying to escape closeness, you've been the one keeping the connection alive, and without your effort, they see the truth of what they've done. Detachment also teaches you strength. When you stop chasing, you learn that your peace doesn't depend on someone else's presence. You see that your worth is not tied to whether or not they come back, and that's a powerful realization for you, not just for them. Avoidants are used to people bending to their distance, but when you don't, you stand out. You become someone they can't easily control with silence or withdrawal, and that in itself is a wake-up call. It's not about punishing them or playing games. It's about showing through your actions that you are not going to abandon yourself to keep them comfortable. And when the avoidant finally starts to feel that shift, it unsettles them. They begin to notice that the dynamic they relied on no longer works. They recognize that the comfort of your pursuit has vanished, and what's left is the raw reality of their own avoidance. That's when they start to replay moments, rethink decisions, and reflect on what they've done. It's in that space of quiet accountability that their mistakes become clear, not because you pointed them out, but because your detachment created the room for them to finally see it. Or when you create calm boundaries with an avoidant, you're not building walls, you're building clarity. A boundary is not about control, it's about respect, both for yourself and for the relationship. With avoidance, the common mistake is either becoming too soft, giving in to every withdrawal, or becoming too harsh, demanding closeness with anger. Neither works. What does work is calm firmness, a tone that says, I value myself enough to say no without yelling. I value the relationship enough to be clear without drama. Boundaries spoken calmly carry more weight than boundaries shouted in frustration because calmness removes the escape hatch of blaming your delivery. An avoidant relies on patterns. They know if they pull away, you'll chase. They know if they go silent, you'll talk more. They know if they create distance, you'll try harder. A calm boundary interrupts that cycle because it places the responsibility back where it belongs. When you say without anger, I'm not going to keep explaining myself when you shut down, or I'm not available for conversations that go in circles, you're showing them the behavior you will and won't participate in. The calm tone disarms them because avoidants often expect intensity, and when they don't get it, they're left with the reality of the boundary itself. The power of calm boundaries is that they don't give the avoidant a villain to fight. If you yell, they can say you're too emotional. If you chase, they can say you're too needy. But when you calmly set a standard, there's nothing to push against except their own behavior. And that quiet accountability makes them uncomfortable because it's no longer about what you did wrong. It's about what they've been avoiding. Boundaries aren't ultimatums, they're clarity statements. They don't demand change, they reveal truth. And when truth is revealed calmly, it's harder to deny. What calm boundaries also do is change the emotional climate of the relationship. Instead of being reactive, you become steady. Instead of riding the highs and lows of their pullback, you stay grounded. That shift unsettles the avoidant because the game they're used to playing doesn't work anymore. They can't bait you into over-explaining. They can't provoke you into losing composure. They can't rely on your reactions to mask their own. They have to sit in the discomfort of your steadiness, and that steadiness forces them to see their own inconsistency. Boundaries also communicate self-worth. When you calmly say no to disrespect, no to being ignored, no to cycles of shutdown and explosion, you are showing that you value yourself more than the illusion of keeping the peace. Avoidants may not say it out loud, but they notice when someone has standards. They notice when their silence no longer controls the room. They notice when the fear of losing them doesn't dictate your choices. And that notice begins to chip away at their belief that distance is power. Because true power is calm clarity, and that's what boundaries give you. A calm boundary doesn't need to be long or complicated. It can be as simple as, I'm not discussing this right now, or I'll be here when you're ready to talk respectfully. It's not about punishing them, it's about protecting yourself. And when you protect yourself consistently, the avoidant realizes that the relationship isn't a one-way street. They see that for the first time, the rules are balanced. They can choose to avoid, but they can't expect you to absorb the cost of that avoidance anymore. That balance is where their mistakes become clear because your calm boundary becomes the mirror of their behavior. Over time, calm boundaries create a new dynamic. The avoidant begins to realize that silence isn't control when you're not afraid of it. Distance isn't power when you don't chase it. Withdrawal isn't protection when you don't cushion it. And in that realization, they are left with only one truth to face. Their avoidance doesn't make them safe, it makes them alone. That awareness doesn't come from your arguments or your explanations. It comes from your ability to stay calm, steady, and clear, even when they try to pull you into the storm. Silence is one of the most powerful responses when you are dealing with an avoidant, because it removes the noise they use to hide from themselves. Most people think silence means weakness or disinterest, but the truth is, silence can communicate more than arguments ever could. An avoidant expects you to fill the gaps with explanations, pleading, or anger, because that takes the attention off of them. But when you stop giving words to the distance, the only voice left in the room is their own. That's when realization starts, because they're no longer distracted by defending themselves against your reactions. They're faced with their own behavior in the quiet. When you argue with an avoidant, they find comfort in the conflict, because conflict becomes proof to them that you are the one making things heavy. It allows them to point to your tone, your words, your intensity, and say that you're the problem. But when you choose silence instead of fueling the cycle, they lose that shield. The silence is uncomfortable, but it's also undeniable. It forces them to notice what they've created, because without your words filling the space, they can't escape the truth of their own withdrawal. Silence is not avoidance on your part, it's discipline, and that discipline creates a shift they're not used to seeing. Silence also gives you back your energy. Every time you argue, you hand them more fuel to say you're overreacting, you're too much, you're unreasonable. But when you choose not to engage, you're no longer pouring energy into a fight that goes nowhere. You protect your peace, you protect your clarity, and you show through your actions that you're not here to convince someone of your worth. That quiet strength unsettles the avoidant because they realize their distance no longer controls your behavior. Silence becomes a boundary in itself, one that cannot be debated or twisted because it simply is. One of the hardest parts about using silence is resisting the temptation to break it. The urge to defend yourself, to make your point, to prove you're right is strong. But silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you're choosing not to say it. It's the restraint that carries the message. And in that restraint, the avoidant is forced to face a reality they've avoided for a long time. They begin to hear the absence of your effort, the absence of your pursuit, the absence of your constant explaining. And that absence is often louder than any words could ever be. Silence doesn't mean shutting down emotionally. It means stepping out of the endless loop that never leads anywhere. You're not playing the game of push and pull. You're not feeding the cycle of distance and chase. You're simply removing yourself from the dance. And when you do that, the avoidant feels the weight of leading the dance alone. Without you filling in the gaps, they're left with the hollow sound of their own steps. And that's when the realization creeps in. They start to see that the problem isn't your reaction, it's their avoidance. Silence becomes the mirror that reflects back the truth without you having to say a word. Silence also builds respect. When you don't engage in pointless conflict, you show that your peace is more valuable than winning an argument. You demonstrate that you won't be dragged into proving yourself over and over again, and that steadiness earns a kind of respect that words rarely can. The avoidant begins to see that they can't pull you into their storm, and that awareness disrupts the power they once thought they had. Silence becomes a teacher, not just to them, but to you as well, because it reminds you that not every action deserves a reaction, and not every distance needs to be closed by force. Over time, silence can shift the entire dynamic. The avoidant begins to notice that their avoidance no longer creates chaos, it creates stillness. And in that stillness, they feel the consequences of their own choices. They may not admit it right away, but inside, they start to recognize the difference between peace created by your silence and emptiness created by their distance. And that recognition plants the seed of accountability, because it's no longer about what you said, it's about what they finally see in the quiet. The confidence changes the entire power dynamic with an avoidant because it removes the control they thought they had over your emotions. Avoidants rely on the idea that you'll question yourself, that you'll wonder if you're too much, that you'll shrink back when they withdraw. But when you show confidence, when you carry yourself like you know your worth, their usual strategies lose effectiveness. Confidence is not arrogance, it's assurance. It's standing tall in who you are without asking for permission to take up space. And when you hold that kind of energy, the avoidant starts to realize they can no longer define the terms of your relationship for you. Confidence shifts the conversation without you even having to say a word. When you're confident, your tone changes, your posture changes, and the way you respond changes. You stop explaining every little thing. You stop defending your feelings. You stop trying to convince someone to see your value. Instead, your presence carries the message. That subtle shift unsettles the avoidant because they've grown used to controlling the rhythm with their withdrawal, and suddenly your steadiness disrupts that rhythm. You're not chasing, you're not begging, you're simply existing in your strength, and that forces them to reevaluate. Confidence makes boundaries easier to set and silence easier to hold. When you know your worth, you're not afraid of losing someone who doesn't respect it. That perspective flips the script because avoidants thrive when they believe you're terrified of their distance, but confidence removes that fear. You can look at their withdrawal without panicking because you trust yourself enough to handle it. That kind of self-assurance makes them see their avoidance differently because for the first time, it doesn't leave you powerless. It leaves them exposed. They're the only one running, and you're the one standing steady. What confidence also does is break the cycle of overcompensation. Without confidence, you may try to earn love by doing more, explaining more, giving more, just to hold the connection together. But confidence says you don't have to prove your worth. You already have it. That shift forces the avoidant to face the imbalance because you're no longer covering their lack of effort with your extra effort. You stop carrying both sides of the relationship, and in doing so, you reveal their absence in a way that can't be ignored. They start to see the mistakes they've been making, not because you told them, but because your confidence made it undeniable. Confidence is also contagious. When you show up in your own power, it changes the energy around you. The avoidant begins to see that you're not shrinking in their silence, you're not drowning in their distance, you're not bending under their avoidance, you're growing in spite of it. That unsettles them because it shows that their behavior no longer dictates your growth. And when someone realizes their tactics no longer work, they're left to face the truth of why they use them in the first place. That's where accountability begins to take root because confidence leaves no room for excuses. Confidence isn't about never feeling hurt. It's about not letting that hurt control how you see yourself. It's being able to look at the situation and say, I still deserve respect. I still deserve effort. I still deserve love, regardless of how someone else chooses to act. That mindset forces the avoidant to see that their distance doesn't diminish your value, it only diminishes their role in your life. And when you hold yourself with that kind of dignity, the avoidant is confronted with a reality they can't dismiss because you're not arguing for your worth, you're living it. Over time, confidence rewrites the script of the relationship. The avoidant no longer has the same influence over your emotions because you've stepped into a space of security that doesn't depend on them. And in that space, they start to see the mistakes they've been making more clearly. They notice that the distance they thought gave them power actually highlights their weakness. They notice that the withdrawal they thought protected them only leaves them behind. And they notice that your confidence didn't push them away. It simply revealed the imbalance they created, forcing them to finally look in the mirror. Self-respect forces accountability in a way nothing else does because it takes the focus off the avoidant and puts it back on you. When you respect yourself, you stop tolerating behavior that drains you. You stop bending to keep the peace, and you stop excusing patterns that hurt you. Self-respect isn't about confrontation. It's about consistency. It's the quiet discipline of holding yourself to a higher standard, even when it's uncomfortable. And when you do that, the avoidant starts to notice that the old dynamic doesn't work anymore. They can't keep pulling away without consequences because your self-respect won't allow you to carry both sides of the relationship any longer. Self-respect shows up in the choices you make daily. It's in the way you decide not to chase when someone withdraws, in the way you no longer justify their lack of effort, in the way you don't compromise your needs just to avoid conflict. Those small decisions add up, and over time, they create a version of you that is no longer willing to play the same game. The avoidant feels that difference. They realize you're no longer available to cushion their avoidance, no longer willing to take on the emotional labor they refuse to do. That shift holds up a mirror they can't ignore because your behavior highlights their absence in a way. When you act from self-respect, you stop making excuses for why they avoid intimacy. You stop saying things like that's just how they are or they just need more space. Instead, you recognize that avoidance is a choice, and that choice has an impact on you. Self-respect doesn't mean you stop caring, but it does mean you stop carrying. And when you stop carrying, the avoidant is left to face the weight of their own decisions. That reality forces them to confront mistakes they've brushed aside because without your overfunctioning, the underfunctioning can't be hidden anymore. Self-respect also creates a natural boundary without you having to announce it. People with self-respect don't need to over-explain their limits because their actions show it. You won't stay in endless arguments. You won't accept silence as a substitute for communication. You won't sacrifice your values to keep someone comfortable. And the avoidant begins to see that clearly. They notice that you're not trying to pull them back every time they withdraw. They notice you're not twisting yourself into knots to make them feel safe while you feel unseen. That awareness forces them to reflect on their part because your self-respect quietly demands accountability without you ever asking for it. The beauty of self-respect is that it shifts the power dynamic without hostility. You don't need to yell, you don't need to lecture, you don't need to fight. You simply hold yourself to a higher standard, and that standard changes everything. The avoidant who once felt they could control the pace by pulling away realizes that your self-respect allows you to step back too. You're no longer trapped in the push and pull because you're not afraid of what happens if they leave. That steadiness forces them to question the choices they've been making because they can't use your reactions as a distraction anymore. Self-respect also sends the strongest message of all, which is that your value is not up for debate. You're not asking them to see it. You're not begging them to recognize it. You're living it. And when someone lives in their worth, it makes others confront whether or not they can meet them at that level. The avoidant may not admit it out loud, but internally they start to notice the gap between how they show up and what you deserve. And that recognition is uncomfortable because it exposes the truth they've been running from. Self-respect shines a light on the distance they've created, and it shows them what they risk losing by staying stuck in avoidance. Over time, your self-respect changes the tone of the entire relationship. You stop negotiating for basic respect, and instead you embody it. You stop clinging to their potential, and instead you honor your own reality. And in that shift, the avoidant begins to realize that the problem was never that you wanted too much. It was that they were giving too little. Your self-respect becomes the mirror that reflects their mistakes back to them, not with anger, but with clarity. And that clarity forces accountability in a way words or arguments never could.